The drill went deep into the mountain and hit a steel wall. When the workers opened it up and went inside, they realized that the project had to be stopped. What had been hidden there for decades should not have been awakened. Subscribe and write which city you are watching from. The wind had a way of carrying dust across the open flats around Harlow Ridge, scratching the cracked windows of the old construction cabins and scraping at the metal sides of the equipment trailers. When Allison Marsh stepped out of the project SUV, the dry air hit her cheeks with the familiar sting of a place where the earth was still mostly untouched and largely uninterested in the presence of people. The site stretched before her in a disordered sprawl of steel beams, orange generators, and half-assembled scaffolding. Workers moved about with the hurried tension of a crew already behind schedule. She could tell, even before speaking to anyone, that something had gone very wrong. The foreman, Lonnie Bennett, spotted her from across the yard and waved her over with a gesture that was half relief, half impatience. Lonnie looked older than she remembered. Dust settled deep into the wrinkles around his eyes, and his hard hat was scuffed in a way that suggested he'd used it more as a projectile in moments of frustration than a piece of safety gear. He didn't bother with greetings. "Glad you got here fast," he said, lowering his voice as though the mountain might overhear them. "The drill's dead. Not busted. Dead." Allison followed him toward the excavation tunnel, boots crunching over gravel. As they walked, he explained the sequence. The boring machine had been advancing smoothly through granite when, without warning, the drive shaft shuddered, the stabilizers screeched, and the entire mechanism slammed to a stop as if it had hit a wall of reinforced concrete. Lonnie insisted that granite didn't behave that way, and if the drill had struck a boulder, it would have ground through, or at least shattered part of it. Instead, the head had simply twisted off, as though it had struck something harder than anything it had been built to handle. Inside the tunnel, the air was cooler but tinged with burnt metal. Allison crouched near the broken bore head, tracing its warped edges with her gloved fingers. The metal was bent at a sharp angle, and the teeth were sheared completely off. She'd seen wear and tear, but nothing like this. Lonnie handed her a small tray where a few irregular fragments lay scattered. "Pulled these out of the bit housing," he said. "You're not going to like 'em." The fragments weren't rock. They were metallic, dark, dense, oddly textured. Allison lifted one toward her portable lamp. It was heavier than it looked, the kind of weight that suggested a compacted alloy rather than anything naturally occurring. The surface seemed layered, almost laminated, but without visible seams. It looked engineered. "This wasn't in your geological survey," Lonnie said, folding his arms as though ready for an argument. "It wasn't in any survey," Allison replied, studying the shard. "And it shouldn't be here. There's nothing under this ridge but granite and quartz." Lonnie exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that held weeks of stress behind it. "Then what the hell did we hit?" She didn't answer, because she already knew that any answer she gave would be based more in speculation than science. Instead, she began pulling equipment from her pack portable seismographs, a compact ground-penetrating radar unit, thermal sensors. This was why she had been called. She had a knack for reading the earth, for understanding what lay beneath it, the same way a surgeon understood muscle and bone. Years of studying geology, seismic anomalies, and collapsed mines had given her a vocabulary of signals most people never heard. It was the reason companies paid for her consultations. It was also the reason she avoided subterranean environments whenever she could. The memory of her father, buried alive in a mine collapse when she was 18, was something she carried more heavily than any piece of equipment. She placed the sensors in a semicircle around the impact point and initiated a scan. The radar screen flickered, then slowly resolved into a grid. As it began mapping the subsurface, Allison noticed the workers gathering behind Lonnie, whispering among themselves. The tension in the air thickened with every passing second. The radar returned an image that made no sense. A large, angular structure lay beneath the granite floor, its edges perfectly straight. A rectangular chamber, at least 20 yards wide. Multiple internal partitions, smooth walls, a metallic density signature. Not a cave, not a natural void. Something made. Lonnie leaned closer. Tell me that's a glitch. I wish it were, Allison murmured. She adjusted the frequency and ran the scan again. The image returned clearer. Flat plains, impossible symmetry, and most unsettling of all, an emission reading. A faint but steady pulse, as though something inside the structure was producing intermittent energy. Could be a Cold War shelter, Lonnie offered, but without confidence. No, Allison said. Not this deep, and not like this. Word spread quickly through the site that something artificial was buried under the ridge, and the mood became a mix of fascination and unease. The project supervisor authorized a controlled cut into the anomaly, assigning a team of specialist metal cutters to carve through the obstruction. For years, Allison had worked with plasma cutters, and she knew the sound they were supposed to make when contacting steel. But when the first lance touched the barrier, a strange resonance filled the tunnel. A low, humming vibration that seemed to come both from the metal and from somewhere deeper within the earth. The torch sputtered, flared, and then steadied, but the hum persisted. The workers exchanged worried glances. Devices flickered. The air felt charged, like the atmosphere before a lightning storm. The cutting took longer than expected, far longer. The metal wall resisted heat in a way Allison had never seen. The plasma jets glowed brighter, the generators groaned, and twice the torches overheated and shut down, forcing the team to rest. Something about the alloy seemed to distribute heat outward instead of allowing it to penetrate. It's like cutting into a frozen engine block, one cutter muttered. Frozen engine block that fights back, another replied. Allison monitored the process closely, recording every anomaly. Her instruments showed irregular magnetic fluctuations near the barrier, sharp spikes that made no physical sense. Frequencies surged, readings drifted. At times, the needle simply jumped, as if encountering interference from a radio source that didn't exist. When the cut finally broke through and a narrow opening appeared, the tunnel filled with a wave of cold air that smelled faintly metallic and stale. A thin mist drifted from the gap. For a moment, no one moved. Lonnie turned to her. You're the expert. You first? Allison tightened the strap of her headlamp, took a slow breath, and slipped through the opening. The chamber beyond swallowed her in darkness until her light flared. The beam struck a metal floor, walls, and ceiling all uniform, all constructed with precision that did not match any known mid-century engineering. She stepped forward, the echo of her boots trailing her. It was colder inside than she expected, and the air tasted like the inside of an abandoned machine. Dust hung in soft patches, undisturbed for decades. She moved her light across the room. Rows of consoles lined the walls, covered in rust, but unmistakably deliberate in design. Wires ran along the corners, secured with clamps unfamiliar to her. No labels, no warning signs. Only symbols that looked reminiscent of Cyrillic, but distorted, shifted, containing loops and lines no Slavic language used. Her breath tightened. This was not merely a bunker. Someone had built this place with intention, and with technology that seemed ahead of its era. Lonnie climbed through the opening beside her, his boots clanging loudly in the hollow space. Jesus, he whispered, the sound reverberating through the chamber. This is something else. But his voice trailed off because the two of them had just seen what lay in the center of the room. 3 chairs metallic, bolted to the floor. And in each, a human shape slumped forward, limbs stiff, uniforms faded to ashen gray. The bodies had withered into leathery husks, preserved by time and cold. Their heads bowed, faces hollow, eyes sunken into darkness. The uniforms were like nothing Allison recognized. High collars, asymmetrical seams, badges shaped like geometric figures that conveyed no rank she understood. Lonnie swore under his breath. Allison forced herself to move closer. The nearest of the desiccated figures held something in its skeletal grasp. Her light caught paper, cracked and yellowed with age. A notebook bound in metal spirals. She pried it free with gentle care, afraid it might crumble. The first few pages contained lines written in that strange, modified Cyrillic, dense paragraphs filled with dates and technical notation. She recognized the structure of the writing, the systematic note-taking of someone recording a mission or scientific findings, but the content was beyond her ability to decipher. Some symbols resembled letters, she knew, but their arrangement made little grammatical sense. Flipping through the notebook, she found a page that seemed to record events chronologically. One phrase repeated several times, something transliterated to Krai Molchania, the edge of silence. The last entries were shorter, written with uneven strokes. The final page contained only a handful of lines. The date format suggested late 1950s. The last sentence sent a cold shiver through her spine. All exits sealed. System unresponsive. Signal rising. We remain. Allison lowered the notebook slowly. She felt the weight of the years in the room, as if the silence itself had a presence. Lonnie looked pale, unsure where to place his hands, his breath unsteady. Then it happened. A faint metallic click, distant but unmistakable, echoed from the far end of the chamber. Both Allison and Lonnie froze. The sound was subtle, yet deliberate, the sound of a mechanical lock shifting after decades of stillness. The hum she had sensed earlier vibrated through the floor, stronger now, more rhythmic. Allison's eyes met Lonnie's. Neither spoke, but both understood the same thing. They had not simply opened an abandoned facility. They had awakened something inside it. The metallic click reverberated through the chamber long after the sound itself had faded, as if the walls were remembering the motion and repeating it in diminishing echoes. Allison stood still, listening to the hum beneath her boots settle into a slow, rhythmic throb that hadn't been present before. It felt like the heartbeat of something ancient and patient. Lonnie shifted uneasily beside her, wiping his palms against his jeans, as though trying to rid himself of a sensation he couldn't name. Neither of them moved for several seconds, and when they finally did, it was with the careful, measured steps of people who understood that the silence around them was no longer passive. They returned to the opening cut by the plasma torches, emerging into the tunnel with expressions that made the workers step back. Word spread quickly among the small crowd. There were bodies inside, and the structure was bigger than expected, stranger than imagined. Allison said little, but her silence only deepened their unease. She requested additional floodlights and auxiliary generators, insisting they illuminate the entirety of the chamber before proceeding deeper. Lonnie relayed her instructions, though he repeatedly glanced toward the tunnel's mouth, as though contemplating the wisdom of retreat. As the lights roared to life and bright white beams poured into the metallic chamber, shadows retreated, revealing more details that made Allison's stomach tighten. The walls, though rusted, were constructed with precision that suggested intentional design, not improvisation. The consoles, covered with decades of dust, were arranged in an arc, facing inward, as though monitoring something central to the room. The arrangement wasn't military in style. It wasn't industrial. It reminded her more of a research facility, a place built to watch, measure, and record. She approached the nearest console, brushing away layers of grime with the back of her glove. Her fingers traced symbols etched into metal, symbols that followed a pattern she couldn't decipher. They shared ancestry with Cyrillic scripts, but they carried additional strokes, crossbars, and curving extensions that suggested a language influenced by something else entirely. The idea unsettled her. Languages didn't evolve underground, sealed in forgotten chambers. Behind her, Lonnie issued instructions to his team to secure the tunnel and restrict access. Allison could hear the tremor in his voice. It reflected the fear that had taken root in her own chest. She pushed it aside and opened the notebook again beneath the light. The paper felt brittle, as if a breath might blow the words away. Yet the ink remained surprisingly dark, strokes crisp and assertive even after decades. The entry spoke of a mission, though whether it was military or scientific was unclear. Words like monitoring, containment, and cycles appeared throughout. Some sentences contained numeric sequences that reminded her of calibration logs. Others, though illegible in meaning, seemed emotional, their slanted characters betraying stress. She reread the final entry again, unwilling to ignore the weight it carried. All exits sealed, system unresponsive, signal rising. Whatever had happened in this place had not been a gradual shutdown or an ordered evacuation. The people in those chairs had been trapped. The structure had become their tomb. Overhead, the lights flickered once, a brief but distinct tremor in the power supply. Lonnie glanced upward nervously. Probably the generator settling, he tried to say casually, but the false note in his voice was unmistakable. Allison wasn't so sure. Her instruments had shown magnetic fluctuations earlier. Unstable fields could interfere with electronics. She needed data. Kneeling by the console, she placed a small sensor pad against the cold surface of the metal floor. The handheld screen displayed faint waveforms, tiny oscillations she recognized as the same kind of pulse from her earlier radar scans. But now they were stronger, more regular. Something was active inside the structure. Something that had not responded for more than half a century was stirring. She rose slowly, illuminating the far end of the chamber with her lamp. That was where the sound had originated. The click had come from a door set into the wall, half concealed by decay, but clearly designed to slide rather than swing. Unlike the consoles and chairs, this door bore no symbols at all. Its edges were too clean, too purposeful. A seam ran vertically through the center, and faint distortions in the dust around it suggested movement. Lonnie followed her gaze and swallowed audibly. "You really think that opened just now?" "It wasn't open before," she said quietly. The hum beneath her feet pulsed again, slow, steady, rhythmic, almost like breathing. The sensation made her skin prickle, as though the metal itself was alive. She pressed her palm against the surface of the central floor panel. It was cold, but a faint vibration traveled upward through her fingers. A machine of some kind, still receiving power decades after its creators had died. "Where's this energy coming from?" Lonnie asked, reading her expression. "I don't know," she answered, "but it means the facility isn't dead." That realization rippled through her with equal parts fear and fascination. Most abandoned facilities lost structural integrity within years, let alone decades. For lights to glow, machinery to hum, doors to move, there had to be a power source unaffected by time, temperature, or neglect. No known batteries could survive so long. No generator could run without maintenance. Even nuclear systems required oversight. This wasn't a bunker built with mid-century technology. It was something else entirely. They spent the next hour mapping what they could access. Allison traced the floor patterns, noting that the grid beneath the rust looked too symmetrical to be accidental. She found conduits in the walls, thick, insulated lines that carried no visible markings. And in one corner of the chamber, she discovered something that made her breath halt, a reel-to-reel video unit, its casing dented but intact. Several metal canisters lay beside it, each containing a roll of magnetic tape. She almost didn't believe her eyes. Equipment like this had been phased out decades ago, yet here it had been sealed away for generations. She picked up the first canister gently. Dust fell away from the markings, revealing a sequence of symbols that might have been catalog numbers. The weight of the reel felt wrong, denser, as if the tape inside contained more layers than typical film. Lonnie whistled low. "What do you think is on it?" he asked. "Only one way to find out," she murmured. They relocated the tape to a portable cabin where the lighting was stable. Allison set the tape on a table, watching it anxiously, as if it might animate on its own. She knew she shouldn't power the unit without verifying stability, but caution battled with curiosity. The mountain seemed to hold its breath as she connected a voltage regulator and carefully fed the tape into the unit. The machine hesitated, sputtered, then hummed to life. A distorted image flickered across the small display monitor, grainy, monochrome, marred by static. For several seconds, nothing coherent appeared, only lines and noise. Then slowly, like a ghost emerging from fog, a figure materialized. A man in a gray uniform. The same strange uniform worn by the bodies in the chamber. His face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp even in the blurred resolution. He seemed exhausted, standing at a console, speaking in the strange, almost Cyrillic language. His voice came through as a muffled, uneven, static-laced pattern of sounds, but his tone needed no translation. He was terrified. She watched as he leaned closer to the camera, clutching the edge of the console. His words accelerated. Behind him, a warning light flickered erratically. The machine produced interference, but Allison caught fragments, stilted sounds that resembled Russian, but were twisted, broken, stretched. Something like signal appeared repeatedly, and something like not opening. The man gestured toward a sealed door behind him, striking it with the flat of his hand. The video shook slightly, suggesting structural vibrations. Voices shouted off camera. A distant alarm began to pulse. Then the screen went black. Allison stared at the machine long after the image disappeared. The weight of what she had seen pressed on her chest, and she had to remind herself to breathe. That man had been alive when the camera recorded, alive and trapped. Lonnie broke the silence. "We shouldn't have seen that." "We needed to see it," she replied. He shook his head. "Something in there killed those people, Allison, or trapped them. And now we're poking around in it like we're tourists." "It wasn't a cave-in or a collapse," she said firmly. "The system locked them in. You saw it too." "Yeah. Which means, whatever did, that could still be operational." She didn't respond, because she had already reached the same conclusion. The facility wasn't dead. It was sleeping, and their intrusion was waking it. When she returned to the chamber, the hum had deepened. It no longer felt ambient. It felt directional, emanating from a specific place. The sealed door at the far end, the one she had seen shift earlier. She approached it with slow caution, each step deliberate. Her flashlight beam glinted off the metallic seam. Then she saw it, an outline in the dust. A faint, crescent-shaped symbol had appeared on the upper panel of the door. She was certain it hadn't been there before. She reached out, hesitant but compelled, and brushed the dust aside. Beneath her glove, the symbol was etched into the surface, glowing faintly blue, as though reacting to her presence. Her pulse quickened. She stepped back sharply. Lonnie moved toward her, but she raised a hand to stop him. A soft whir began behind the door, and a thin line of light appeared in the seam, widening slowly. Lonnie swore and dragged one of the workers behind him. The men scrambled backward, but Allison remained where she was, mesmerized by the movement. The door was opening. Not abruptly, not violently. Calmly, predictably, as if this step had been waiting for someone, for her. The opening reached barely half an inch when the glow ceased abruptly, and the mechanism froze. A cold draft oozed through the gap, brushing past her ankles like icy fingers. Behind the door, something moved. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a faint, unmistakable shift of air and a sound close to breathing. She stepped back. Her heart hammered. Lonnie looked at her, eyes wide, silently pleading for her to call the retreat. For a moment she considered it, but something deep inside her, some blend of fear and curiosity, rooted her to the spot. Whatever lay behind that door hadn't been alone all these years. And now, it was waking. She couldn't help but feel that the mountain hadn't just been hiding a forgotten facility. It had been restraining something far older, far stranger, and far more patient than the people who had died here. For the first time since descending into the chamber, she realized the truth. They were not discovering the past. The past was discovering them. And something behind the sealed door had just started breathing down the years of silence. The air leaking through the narrow gap in the sealed door made Allison feel as though the mountain itself had begun to exhale. A faint, cold shimmer drifted along the floor, curling around her boots like slow-moving fog. The draft carried no scent, only an icy sterility that reminded her of hospital corridors and forgotten morgues. Behind her, Lonnie shifted nervously, muttering curses under his breath. The workers had retreated several yards back, their faces pale in the harsh glare of the floodlights. No one dared speak above a whisper, as if even sound might provoke the thing on the other side. Allison stared at the gap without blinking, fighting the instinct to step back and run. But fear was not the only thing rooted in her chest. There was a pull, something that felt both familiar and foreign, like a memory she couldn't quite place, yet couldn't ignore. The hum beneath their feet continued, low and steady, pulsing like a submerged engine or the breathing of some slumbering creature. It had grown stronger since the moment the door shifted. The vibrations traveled up her legs and into her chest, echoing against her heartbeat until the rhythms blurred into one another. Before anyone could move, a sudden crackle erupted from the intercom clipped to Lonnie's vest, making several workers flinch. A voice burst through, harsh with static. "All personnel, hold positions," it commanded. Major Hayes approaching the lower tunnel. Do not engage with the anomaly. Repeat, do not engage. Lonnie grumbled under his breath, but Allison barely heard him. Her attention remained fixed on the door. Another faint sound came from behind it, a mechanical tick, like gears aligning after decades of stillness. The gap widened by less than a fraction of an inch, but the change was unmistakable. By the time Major Hayes descended the tunnel, the atmosphere had shifted. The rumbling hum had grown into a palpable pressure in the air, pushing inward like a tide. Hayes stormed in with 2 armed contractors flanking him, though their weapons remained holstered. His face had none of the skepticism he'd worn earlier. The stern mask he presented before was gone, replaced by a tension that ran too deep to hide. "What did you do?" Hayes demanded the moment he reached Allison. "I didn't do anything the system wasn't waiting for," she replied quietly. Hayes's jaw tightened. He turned toward the door, with a mixture of dread and recognition, like someone coming face to face with a story he had heard, only in hushed, unofficial briefings. Allison watched his reaction carefully. He knew something. Maybe he didn't know everything, but he knew enough to be afraid. "Shut it," Hayes ordered sharply. "Seal it immediately." "We can't," Allison said. "It opened on its own." He spun toward her, eyes blazing. "Then what exactly do you propose we do, Ms. Marsh? Stay here and wait for it to open further?" "It already has," she answered. "The question is why?" Before Hayes could respond, the lights flickered again. The tunnel plunged into a momentary darkness before the generators pushed the lamps back into a strained glow. The hum from inside the chamber surged, growing louder until the steel grates beneath their boots vibrated with every pulse. Hayes drew his weapon despite himself. "Everyone stand back," he said, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear tightening his throat. The seam of the door glowed briefly with a soft, cold blue. The lights rippling along the metal reminded Allison of something she had seen on the console earlier, lines of text that had flashed too quickly to read. She stepped closer, unable to resist. Hayes barked at her to move back, but she kept walking until she stood only a few feet from the door. The glow faded. Silence settled for an instant, so complete that the entire group held their breath. Then, with agonizing slowness, the door began to slide open. It didn't jerk or grind, despite decades of inactivity. The motion was smooth, almost graceful, as if whatever mechanism powered it had been kept pristine by forces outside their understanding. The workers backed away, some pressing themselves against the tunnel walls. Hayes raised his gun with trembling hands. Allison did not move. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood steady, transfixed. The door opened wide enough for her to peer inside. The interior chamber was immense, larger than she had imagined. Its walls curved like the inside of a shell. Frost coated the surfaces, glittering under the trembling floodlights. 6 tall capsules stood in a semicircle around a central depression in the floor. 5 of the capsules were dark, their glass fronts clouded, surfaces mottled with the corrosion of time. Frozen remnants of bodies lay slumped inside them. Shapes indistinguishable, bones tangled in tattered suits that resembled the uniforms of the corpses they had found earlier. But the 6th capsule was different. A soft blue light pulsed softly within it, illuminating the interior. The glass was clean, free of frost. The silhouette inside was unmistakably human, or nearly so. A man lay suspended within the capsule, his eyes closed, his body still, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. The light pulsed in perfect rhythm with his breathing, as though the capsule itself were alive. Allison felt her pulse quicken. Hayes muttered something she couldn't catch, his voice cracking. Lonnie swore softly behind her. The man inside the capsule was stunningly symmetrical, his skin unblemished, features unnervingly precise. Not beautiful, not in a way that comforted, but flawless, in a way that unsettled. His eyelashes were long and dark against pale skin. His hair floated around him like a dark halo. 2 angular marks, triangular scars, rested on his temples, faintly glowing. On the control panel beside the capsule, symbols began to appear. Blue lines traced themselves across the screen, forming phrases in that strange, half-familiar language. Allison found herself stepping closer, drawn in by a mix of terror and awe. Then the symbols shifted. They reorganized, rearranged, resolved into English letters. Stabilization complete. Hayes froze. What the hell? More words appeared. Environment acceptable. Awakening. Allison felt every hair on her arms rise. Oh God! It's responding to the atmosphere. The capsule hissed softly. A thin line formed along its edges as the glass began to retract. The light dimmed slightly, giving the impression of something inhaling deeply after a long sleep. "Stay back," Hayes ordered, though he himself didn't move. His feet were rooted to the ground. The glass slid open fully, and a gust of chilled air poured out. The man inside shuddered once, a full-body tremor, and then his eyes opened. They were not like human eyes. They were too bright, irises too large, reflecting the lights around him like polished obsidian lenses. He blinked slowly, adjusting to the brightness of the chamber. His gaze fell first on the ceiling, then drifted to the consoles, the darkened capsules, and finally to Allison. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between them, the hum quieting as though the facility itself paused to witness the moment. He did not speak, He simply breathed, each inhale deliberate, each exhale controlled. Allison felt something invisible brush against her mind, a pressure, a tingling, as if a thought had grazed hers. She staggered back a half step. The wall-mounted screen beside the capsule lit up again. They tried to stop the signal. They were not permitted. System protected primary observer. Allison swallowed hard. She didn't need to know who they were. She had already seen their bodies, slumped over consoles, notebooks clutched in skeletal hands. They had tried to escape. They had tried to shut down the system. The system had stopped them. Behind her, Hayes whispered, "This wasn't a shelter. It was a containment facility." But Allison wasn't convinced. The positioning of the capsules, the layout of the room, the way the consoles faced inward, it all felt wrong for containment. No. This place was not built to hold the man inside the capsule. It was built to watch him. Suddenly, alarms blared throughout the facility, soft at first, then escalating. The lights shifted to a deep red hue. The floor vibrated violently. On the screen, new text flashed. "Autonomous protection cycle initiated." Sealing perimeter. Hayes whipped toward the exit. "It's closing the tunnel. Move! Move now!" Workers panicked, scrambling toward the opening they had cut earlier. Allison turned toward the man in the capsule. He remained still, watching her. Not with malice, not with fear, but with recognition. As if he had been waiting. The vibrations intensified. Metal shrieked somewhere deep in the structure as enormous mechanisms shifted. The exit door began to slide shut. Hayes shouted orders. Lonnie grabbed Allison's arm, pulling her toward the opening. "Come on! The whole place is collapsing!" A section of the ceiling cracked, sending debris raining down. Allison sprinted with Lonnie, dodging falling shards of metal. The hum grew louder, more erratic. Lights burst one by one. As they reached the tunnel mouth, the ground lurched violently. Allison stumbled, catching herself on the jagged edge. Behind her, she heard a sound, like an enormous exhale, followed by a roar that shook the mountain. She turned back just long enough to see the man in the capsule step forward, though his feet never seemed to touch the ground. He stood bathed in the last surviving blue glow of the chamber. The facility walls folded inward, metal grinding against metal. The final message flashed across the screens before sparking out. "Signal transmitted." Secondary node active. The chamber collapsed, swallowing him in darkness. Lonnie dragged her out through the shrinking exit a split second before the entire interior imploded. The workers burst into the daylight, stumbling onto the rocky slope outside. A thunderous rumble echoed through Harlow Ridge as the ground caved in, consuming the opening, the tunnel, the chamber, everything. Dust billowed across the site. The mountain settled into a heavy silence, as though sealing the secret once more. Allison collapsed to her knees, chest heaving. Hayes stood several yards away, staring at the collapsed ridge with disbelief etched deep into his face. Then, slowly, he turned to her. "You knew something was wrong the moment you walked in, didn't you?" She didn't answer. She stared at the dust rising from the ruins, hearing again the final words that had flashed across the screen. Secondary node active. Somewhere out there, beneath another stretch of earth, another chamber waited. And something inside it had just awakened. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Watch the other videos on the channel. There's a lot more waiting for you. And share this video with someone who loves stories like this.